You're listening to the Building Psychological Strength podcast, Professional Edition. My name is April Seifert. Not only am I a doctoral level psychologist, but I've been a successful entrepreneur for a number of years and have learned firsthand that building psychological strength can have a direct impact on your professional success. In this Friday edition of the podcast, I'll offer you tools, tips, tricks, and information to help you become stronger, more resilient, and more successful. Let's get to it. Eric Butterworth said, "Don't go through life, grow through life." Welcome back, everybody. I'm really excited about this episode because it's actually a little follow-up to last week's Friday episode, the Professional Edition episode about giving negative feedback. And this week, on this Friday's episode, I actually wanted to flip the coin over and from the same perspective of emotional intelligence, talk a bit about receiving negative feedback. I want you to think about this. Think about a situation when you were in that position, when you were getting negative feedback from somebody else. And I mean, let's be real. A lot of times that quote unquote negative feedback might just be a simple request to do things differently next time. Or maybe it is very, very constructive and the person's intentions are the best possible. They're not being degrading. They're not attempting to make you feel bad, but our minds kind of put that spin and put that lens on it. So let's include those situations in this, but also times when, maybe you do feel that like that other person is being a bit deprecating or that they are coming into it with intentions that aren't that great. Let's lump all of that together. Essentially, what I'm talking about is being in the situation where you are on the receiving end of feedback and maybe you feel a little bit threatened, right? Like if we're being honest, it doesn't feel good to get negative feedback. And it feels threatening. We may feel guilty. We may feel angry as a result of getting that feedback. And all of those emotions together, especially if a bunch of them show up at the same time and they get into that murky gray sludge of emotion that gets really hard to tease apart, it can be really tough to act effectively. And in those situations where our emotions are running high, yet it's important to behave in an effective manner, like our professional settings, emotional intelligence is what we want to lean on. Now, again, I talked about it last week from the perspective of elements of emotional intelligence. So there's actually 5, but last week I highlighted 2 of the elements that are really important to keep in mind when you're giving negative feedback. I want to highlight 2 that are really important when we are receiving negative feedback this week. And that's not to say the rest of the factors aren't important, but these really stand out as being critically important when we're on that receiving end. So let's dive into those and let's talk a little bit about what we can do to improve or strengthen our ability in those areas so that we're in a much better position next time when we're on the receiving end of a feedback conversation. First thing I want to touch on, the first factor is actually one that I talked about last week. It is self-awareness. And to me, emotional intelligence, the buck really starts here. It doesn't stop here. The buck starts here. Emotional or self-awareness about our own emotional state, or having the definition of it, having complete knowledge of your emotions, feelings, behavior, morals, strengths, and weaknesses, and then understanding how these will affect people around you. Having that awareness is really the first step before you can do any of these other elements well. We have to be able to understand our own emotional landscape minute to minute if we're going to be able to behave effectively or do any of the other stuff that I'm going to talk about on the podcast. So in that moment, and I mentioned this gray emotional sludge, one of the most skillful things you can learn how to do in the emotional landscape, emotional intelligence landscape, is to tease apart emotions that are happening at the same time. So I talk about this gray emotional sludge. Let me give you an example of this or tell you what the full analogy actually is. Imagine you have a big bucket and you have a whole bunch of other smaller buckets of different types of paint. And you open up the first can of paint and it's blue, and that can of paint represents grief, say. So you take that blue paint and you pour it into your larger bucket. Then you open up a second can of paint, and that paint is green. And maybe that paint represents envy. So you take that green paint and you pour it into the blue paint. And then you open up the next can of paint and it's red. And let's say that red paint represents anger. And you take that red paint and you pour it into the big bucket with the green and the blue. If you mix that up, what color is it? Sludge, right? Total sludge. And that's pretty much what our emotions feel like when we have anger and guilt and resentment, and we're feeling like we need to protect ourselves and we want to lash out. All those things get mixed up together and you end up with emotional gray sludge. And one of the most skillful things you can learn how to do is get the blue paint back. To identify that there's blue paint in there and isolate it. To see it for what it is, understand what might be triggering it, what might be enhancing it, why it might be there, what it's trying to tell you, and do that in isolation of the green paint that you get back out of that sludge. And so I want to make that point because when you're in these scenarios, like in the scenario where you're receiving negative feedback, that emotional gray sludge comes fast and furious. And practicing the ability to get quiet and paying attention, and here's the key, paying attention to your own reactions from an observer's standpoint. Observing the emotions that you're feeling and really getting systematic about it. Asking yourself, might I be feeling anger right now? Might I be feeling sadness right now? Is there any element of sadness in this gray sludge? What about guilt? Do I feel guilty? What about envy? And being really honest about the emotions that you're experiencing, because it can feel quote unquote wrong to admit that we feel envious, for example. I'm jealous of you for what you have. When in reality, it is a natural occurring emotion. It means nothing about you. It just means that you experienced an emotion, and that's okay. But being able to sit quietly, tease apart your emotions, and be really honest with yourself about what you're feeling, the more you practice that, the more you will deepen and strengthen your ability to be self-aware, and that is the critical first step. Second component of emotional intelligence that I want to highlight is self-regulation. Okay, let's think about this here, right? You're sitting there and maybe it's your boss or your significant other, and they are coming to you with something that they want you to do differently. Maybe they're even upset and they're giving you this negative feedback, and you are aware of the fact that you are feeling anger, that you are feeling resentment toward them, that you maybe want to retaliate. This is where self-regulation comes in, and it is concerned with how you control and manage yourself and your emotions, inner resources, and abilities. And it also includes your ability to manage your impulses. How important is that, right? Because these emotions that we feel can make our behavior very impulsive. And typically, from a long-term perspective, the behavior that we feel the impulse, the action that we feel the impulse to take isn't necessarily the one that's going to be the most effective in the long term. So the more that we can boost our ability to self-regulate, the better. Now, before I dive into a way to do that, I want to make one caveat. Self-regulation and self-awareness, think about what we're doing here. We're acknowledging the feelings that we're having, and we're regulating our behavior. What we are not doing is repressing an emotion or ignoring it or pretending like it doesn't exist. That's never going to be effective. We're acknowledging our emotions, we're admitting that they are there, and then we're essentially deciding how we're going to act in terms of what is the outcome that we want to get. So we're talking about taking action that's effective in moving you in a helpful direction. So again, a way to do that, it's going to start with mindfulness again. It's going to start with not necessarily recognizing your own emotions, as in, self-awareness, how we just talked about it, but recognizing your behavioral urges. What are you feeling the urge to do? And the rubric of fight, flight, or freeze is a good one to start with to help you navigate that, because that's what we tend to resort to when we feel a little bit cornered, the way that you might when you're receiving negative feedback. So get really mindful and curious and observe the emotion or the action impulses that you are feeling like you want or feeling like you have in that moment. And once you have them, there's something amazing about just acknowledging that something exists psychologically, acknowledging that I'm having the impulse to walk out of this meeting. I'm having the impulse to shout at that person. It almost buys you just a little bit of psychological spaciousness and time to make a decision about how you want to act. And if you can get that, if you can get just that moment to make a decision, that gives you the opportunity to decide to behave in a way that fuels your longer term goals, that points you in a direction of what's important to you in a longer term basis, not just being reactive right here in this moment. So thinking about a way to strengthen both self-awareness and self-regulation hopefully will put you in a much better position the next time you are on the receiving end of negative feedback. The last thing that I want to say also on self-regulation, one more thing, is that if you can't regulate in the moment, if you're feeling like, no, I'm way too hot-headed, I can't do it right in this moment, there's nothing wrong with asking for a little bit of time to process. Hey, great, thanks for telling me that. Can I just have like a day or so to just process that? I'll get back to you. We'll continue this conversation at that point. I just want a little bit of time to just process and think about it. Totally fine. A much better and much more emotionally intelligent way of behaving than if you were to just react in that moment and do something that you might regret later on. All right, before I go, I recently introduced you to the Blinkist app, which takes some of the best, most influential, most valuable nonfiction books and gists them down into 15 to 20 minute summaries. So in 15 to 20 minutes, you can listen to a series of blinks and understand the key concepts, insights, and take-home points from some of the most transformative books. And you can get started for free. And if you like this episode, I might suggest listening to the 10-minute blink of the book Emotional Intelligence 2.0. I want to thank Blinkist for sponsoring this show, and because you're a listener, you can try Blinkist for yourself for free for 7 days using the link in this episode description. And because you're a listener of the podcast, you get 20% off an entire year of Blinkist by clicking the link below. Thank you so much for joining me for this professional edition of the Building Psych Strength podcast. If you are an entrepreneur or a business professional and you're interested in becoming more successful, hit the subscribe button. Until next week, friends, be strong, be resilient, and be successful.